Ladies and gentlemen, let's Gaming Video. We're going to be reviewing ASUS's gaming Strix Radeon R9 380X. In the interests of full disclosure, I'd like to thank AMD for sending over the GPU for review. This is not a sponsored video, however, once again, this is a review sample, but do take a look at the channel pretty soon, because if you follow along, we're also going to be reviewing some FreeSync monitors and some other AMD hardware over the next week or two. So getting into the GPU review itself, this card is the full Tonga experience. It, as you've probably seen on screen, features a greater number of stream processors, a greater number of texture units and higher clocks compared to what is found in the 285 or the 380. Just for clarification's sake, we've been comparing the 380X against the 285, but the 285 and the 380 are essentially the same GPU core, just with very slight differences in clock speed. While the benchmarks play out on screen, we have sped these up, by the way, by quite a considerable amount, 250% in many cases, just to get through them as quickly as possible. We've included most of the really popular games as well. We're going to be discussing the actual GPU and what ASUS have managed to do with the build quality, the heat, and all of the other bits and pieces that you're looking for when you're actually purchasing a new graphics card. So first things first, we'll be discussing the cooler on the GPU. Now, as you've probably guessed by now, it is using the Direct CU2 cooler. It has fairly beefy heat pipes and other parts which help to dissipate the heat from the core, RAM chips and VRMs, as well as a backplate too. Now, there is two large black fans which cover up much of the card's top, and these, for the most part, idle at a fairly low speed. We'll get more into that in just a second. And finally, I'd like to mention that the GPU is about 10.5 inches in length, so most cases should easily be able to fit this card in without too much of a problem. I did mention fan speeds earlier, so ASUS are rather boastful about its zero noise technology, which means that the fan won't spin while the card is below a certain temperature. This generally means when you're on, say, the Windows desktop, if you're just surfing web pages, that type of thing, the card will be whisper quiet. With that said, with the case open and just under the desk near us, we've barely noticed the card even when it is gaming, when we're running games. However, if you manually start cranking up the fans, particularly to around the 60 to 70% mark, you're definitely going to start hearing them. But typically, just leaving standard fan profiles, running applications like 3D Mark or a Metro Last Light benchmarks, that type of thing, we've barely heard the GPU's revving up the GPU's fan revving up at all. So let's talk more about the specifications of the GPU. So it does feature 2048 unified stream processors, which is compared to the 1792 on the 380 or the 285, or the 2560 found in the 390. Clock speeds, as I've mentioned, are a little higher than the 285 as well, and this does help to crank up the levels of performance. Now, we've heard rumours that AMD were planning to release a fully realised Tonga core for some time. In fact, we heard much about it last year, even when we were reviewing, even before actually we got our hands on the 285, we'd reported that there were many claiming that AMD were poised, ready to release the final iteration of the GPU architecture, but it just didn't happen. Now, one of the things you're probably going to notice is that Tonga doesn't have as much memory bandwidth as you would normally associate with the Radeon architecture. Now, there are some reasons behind this. One of them would be AMD have done a lot to improve the compression of data moving around the board. This is very similar to what NVIDIA managed with the Maxwell architecture. Essentially, to give you the short version, it's lost this compression and helps just to reduce the amount of memory bandwidth that data uses as it travels around the board. AMD claim it's around a 40% saving, which is pretty good when it's reading and writing frame buffer color. So from our testing, we've noticed no real major issues, and that the GPU, particularly at 1080p, performs rather admirably. Indeed, AMD actually took a lot of inspiration from GPUs like the R9 290 or the 390, and it has the same quad shader layout, which allow the GPU to render 4 primitives per clock, and they've also increased the number of asynchronous compute engines as well, which is obviously really good for compute workloads, which is going to be really important with DirectX 12 and Vulkan. A quick note regarding the connections of the card, because obviously you're going to need to put wires into the damn thing to make the thing work. It does feature DVI-I, DVI-D, 1 DisplayPort and 1 HDMI. We are typically running with DisplayPort when we're running with FreeSync, and it works absolutely beautifully. We're going to discuss more about that when we are reviewing FreeSync in a very, very soon video, but we've captured with this with HDMI. It does also require 2 6-pin power connectors and puts it to around a TDP of 190 watts, which is certainly higher than that found in the GTX 960, which we've also reviewed. We reviewed MSIs, so you should check that video out if you want more information, or have a look at the link which will take you to an article where we reviewed all of the cards in much more in-depth analysis. But Maxwell, the 960, only takes 120 watts TDP, whereas this is 190. To be honest with you, it's not really a big deal. In my opinion, in this case, if gaming is your primary concern, the 380X does definitely offer quite a significant improvement to the GTX 960. So who is this card targeted at? With the price point of around 200 British pounds, or around 240, 250 US dollars, obviously depending how much shopping around you're doing. I'm just looking at amazon.co.uk or amazon.com respectively. This card is certainly targeted towards individuals who are looking for 1080p. In our tests, we've not really had any issues running the latest games at 1080p, 60 FPS with all settings maxed out. Aside from the ultra super duper demanding titles, for example GTA 5, which obviously if you start to really crank up the shadows and other details, it can be really taxing on any graphics card. With that all said, we still get crazy frame rates, which is pretty damn impressive. Tomb Raider Ultra Tres FX with FXAA enabled, almost 70 frames a second. Bioshock Infinite 1080p, absolute highest settings, almost 87 frames a second. Thief, everything maxed out with FXAA, 95 frames a second. Shadow of Mordor, 60 frames a second. And Mad Max, as you'll see in this video, 70 to 90 frames a second throughout absolute highest settings once again. And Crysis 3, which is pretty damn demanding, 55 to 60 frames per second throughout an average of 55 FPS, absolute maximum settings. Simply for the sake of brevity, we couldn't include all of the 1440p benchmarks in this, although you do have a roundup towards the end of the video. But despite all of this, frame rate 1440p is also pretty solid. If you're a 60 FPS or die type of gamer, you might need to reduce MSAA or such, but even so, titles like Tomb Raider are going to be able to run at 50-ish frames per second with Tres FX enabled, which is obviously rather demanding, particularly on the PC. GTA 5 at very high MSAA ×2 at around 41, 42 frames a second. Mad Max obviously runs absolutely excellent because it's extremely well optimized. Witcher 3 Wild Hunt with everything at the highest settings, 30 FPS. In other words, you're probably not always going to want to run this GPU at 1440p, but it certainly is capable of doing so if that's your thing. And you're happy to reduce MSAA or other anti-aliasing or other really taxing settings. But the card primarily, as AMD have said themselves, is aimed at the 1080p market. And for bang for buck purposes, it's really hard to argue that it's one of the better offerings on the market right now, particularly as there's very little difference in pricing, at least at the time I'm looking, between the 380 and the 380X, and it's also quite close as well to the GTX 960 while being fairly cheap in comparison to the GTX 970. I think for many gamers it's going to be a toss-up between the 380X, the 390, and the GTX 970 GPUs unless you're going for absolute insane resolutions or you've got the money to throw it onto your PC rig. But time is getting short, so rather than discussing bang for buck for much longer, let's instead talk about one of the biggest, I imagine, caveats that many of you are wondering about: overclocking. So we did do some overclocking with the GPU, although we're going to admit the results for this video simply for the sake of brevity. But the bad news is the core voltage is grayed out, so you can't increase the core voltage of the GPU, but you can increase the power limit. We're utilizing MSI's Afterburner. We managed pretty decent clocks. With the power limit tapped out to plus 20%, we managed a final core clock of 1150 MHz and a final memory clock of 1550 MHz. Now, we did manage to get the card at higher speeds, but we weren't particularly happy because we noticed the odd bit of speckling throughout the benchmark, and we really didn't have enough time to tweak anymore. Obviously, you are playing the Silicon Lottery anyway, but we decided to be more cautious and back off on the clocks a little more. But as you can imagine, performance scaled fairly linearly. We had around 10% more performance across the board with the applications that we were testing. So for the sake of argument, Tomb Raider hit around 73 FPS with the same settings that I've just mentioned at 1080p. Firestrike hit well over 10,000. 3D Marks with just GPU testing only. So pretty much all good news, at least in my opinion. I would also like to mention my experiences so far with FreeSync, if only briefly. As I mentioned, we are reviewing a FreeSync monitor, so do follow along if you want more information on this. But so far, our experiences with FreeSync have been pretty good. We're using a 144Hz screen, and honestly, the difference between having it enabled and not enabled is pretty tangible. I will confess I've not tried out G-Sync, so I'm not going to give a like-for-like comparison, but so far my experiences, at least with FreeSync, have been fairly positive. It's pretty easy to enable as well. It's not particularly complicated. We will be having a look at the drivers section of the new Crimson drivers of AMD in just a second, but overall my experience has been pretty positive. So if you are kind of weighing up between the two NVIDIA and AMD technology, I would say they're pretty interchangeable at the moment. And I say this as someone who has several NVIDIA cards and several AMD cards, and actually one NVIDIA card in one of my systems and one AMD card in another one of my systems. So that's just my personal opinion, of course. Oh, and before I forget, if you want more information regarding our testing methodologies, driver revisions, hardware used, and other such things, you can go ahead and check out the article where all of that is discussed in depth. Before we close out the video, however, I'd like to take a moment to familiarise you with AMD's latest graphics card drivers known as Crimson. So AMD did get some flack regarding their older driver revisions, and if there was one glaring weakness with AMD's cards, it would be the drivers. It's not that I personally had any crashing or anything like that, but I didn't find the drivers particularly friendly. They were a little awkward to use compared to NVIDIA's, and another major criticism I personally had was that they didn't officially support downsampling. Fortunately, most of these issues have been resolved with the release of the new graphics card drivers. It's not necessarily that a ton of extra functionality has been added into the drivers, although there are some, such as the aforementioned downsampling, but it's primarily that it makes things a lot easier and a lot more intuitive to use. This is particularly true for gamers who aren't quite so familiar with PC gaming. It means that you get much better descriptions over what an option does, and it's a lot easier to simply make a change based on a single game. For the sake of argument, if you want to force texture filtering in one application or disable VSync in another application across the board, but maybe just have it in one thing, you can much more simply do that compared to the older versions of Catalyst. That's not to say, once again, that the old version of Catalyst isn't there, because the old version of Catalyst was quite powerful, particularly when it comes to multi-monitor configurations, color adjustments, that type of thing. But with this, you get a nice, simple and intuitive interface, which is certainly appreciated, at least in my opinion, because power users probably won't make a big deal out of things like that, but you know, if you just want to quickly change something, it is rather nice. As I mentioned, the fact that downsampling is now officially supported by AMD is also a really big positive step in the right direction. Previously, Nvidia had supported downsampling and AMD hadn't. You had to go through the whole third-party utilities, and it was, to be honest with you, messy. I never got it working properly on my particular display setup, but now it has been corrected, and then you can simply enable it and then choose your desired resolution. If you decide to enable downsampling, AMD, by the way, refer to this as virtual super resolution, and he does a pretty good job, as you can imagine, of rendering games at a higher resolution, then lowering the resolution based on your monitor. It's basically the reverse of what consoles do often to improve performance, and he does a really nice job of improving texture quality, overall graphical quality, reducing jaggers and much more, because obviously, just like Nvidia's GPUs, you're able to run that with MSAA or what have you, and it looks rather beautiful, if I do say so myself. Finally, I'd like to close out by saying that I heartily recommend GPU if it fits within your price budget range. Excellent card, and unfortunately for Nvidia, they don't have anything quite to match the pricing of the GPU right this moment. But hopefully you've enjoyed the video and found it somewhat informative. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.